to have some type of mold issue start to pop up that isn't going to be seen until somebody pops their head above that ceiling and sees exactly how bad, or depending on the material of the ceiling, it starts to come through, grow through, and then it becomes evident to you. And that's how sometimes one problem poorly addressed, or I won't say poorly addressed, how about incompletely addressed, can lead to even a larger problem.
Infection stops where information starts. Welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast, where knowledge is your strongest defense. Broadcasting from the front lines of healthcare, we dive into the strategies, science, and stories shaping infection prevention today. Each episode, we connect you with experts on real-world insights to help you stop the spread of healthcare-associated infections, protect patients, and strengthen your practices as an infection prevention and public health expert. When the right information reaches the right people, lives are saved.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. Today we're talking all about mold remediation. What are our first signs that it may be an issue? How do we remediate it once we see it? And we'll be talking with a couple of experts on their experience with mold remediation. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsors.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ, let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollenbeek, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control. And today we're talking about everybody's maybe least favorite topic, mold remediation, and looking at what's going on behind your walls. We're joined today by Trey Morrow and Jill Holdsworth as our co-hosts. How are you guys?
I'm good. How are y'all doing?
Great. Excited to be here, Garrett, and we're joined by two of my favorite people, so I'm excited to hear what they have to say, and I know it's going to be exciting and gross at the same time, so can't wait.
That is right up the alley, I feel like, of a lot of our episodes, is if you don't go away from this thinking, I'm worried about something new, we didn't do the podcast right. So to tell us about something, not only that we might need to be worried about, but also how worried we should be, and then how we handle it when we see it, is Aaron Preston and Nate Sanders. How are you guys?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So Nate, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, your career, and why people dread calling you.
So I am a certified industrial hygienist. I work for a company called Building Forensics Group. I've been in this industry for about 25 years. I am the quintessential consultant where, when things go wrong, I get the phone call of, help me put this fire out. And it's all related to the built environment, trying to control mold and moisture, water within the building.
And this is neat because we had a guest on earlier, and I think the built environment was kind of a new term, at least for me. And so now we're hearing it again. So it's really reinforcing that. So
it was
Aaron,
a new term for me too. So I was actually kind of excited that he said it just now, because I'm like, wait, I know what that is now because of our earlier episode.
Yeah.
Exactly. Once you have a built environment, you need to control it. And that's where, our expertise comes in is controlling inside your box.
And
Nice.
I'm actually pretty familiar with it. Being in Florida, we have mold everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah. I mean, our sweet spot is hot and humid. So I've always said, if you draw a line from, Nashville South, Rio North, that's where we work. Just wrap it around the world.
That makes sense. Aaron Preston, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with mold a little bit. I think will be a good starting point to kick this episode off.
Thanks. Yeah, hello, my name is Aaron Preston. I'm an infection preventionist. I'm a field specialist with AMBU USA with an infection prevention and also sterile processing. I've worked at multiple acute care facilities, though, as an infection preventionist prior to this role, where I tended to be either one of the senior or lead IPs for those facilities. I have my certification in infection prevention as well as the advanced leadership certification in infection prevention, which is a little newer. I've given some presentations both at the APIC conference on engineering controls, especially during disaster, as well as the webinars on outbreaks of waterborne diseases on acute care units, and then also some presentations on central line infections, dialysis, and a few other things, just because IPs like to keep it interesting, right? And so, my experience with mold is usually when somebody calls because they have a suspicion that something is going on. It actually got to the point where I actually had a facilities supervisor that would literally come to me and said, somebody said the M word, I don't want to say it.
It's also like the A word.
It's a good point. The first question I ask a lot of the hospitals I go into is, how are we describing this 4-letter word?
That's funny because I actually, early in my IP career, our CEO sat us down and said, I don't want to hear the word mold unless we've tested it. It's environmental growth at this point.
It's a trigger word, I tell you. It is a trigger word for a lot of people.
And if I may further introduce these two guests, just from my perspective and knowing them, it is incredible when you have an industrial hygienist that you can truly trust and an IP who has advanced knowledge of these environmental hazards, I'll call them. So mold and water issues. So then when you get two people together like Aaron and Nate who work well together, who have this expertise from both of their sides, and you get them together going on an investigation to figure out things in the facility, it is like a human think tank on mold or Legionella or whatever they're looking at. And it's honestly incredible to watch. You just want to follow them around because you know you're going to learn something, or you're just like going to be running after them trying to take notes. It's really incredible. So if you take nothing else back from this episode, it's to find your Nate or find your Aaron. And if you don't have one, then start to develop your own skills, because it's truly beneficial when you have to have this situation to be investigated. Maybe you never have it. Hopefully that's the case. But when you do, you need a Nate and Aaron team.
I will say, the way I started was literally as an IP new, following around my facilities people. I did follow around Nate for weeks at times, and just taking it all in, asking lots of questions and being observant. And honestly, that's always the best way to learn, right? Like observe, ask questions, rinse and repeat.
Exactly. I mean, very kind words, Jill. And I mean, from my perspective, I never know everything. And especially when I walk into a building brand new. And so I always say, go find the guy with the biggest key ring, because he's been there the longest. And buy him lunch and ask him all the questions, because he knows where the skeletons are.
He also knows where all the plumbing is,
Exactly.
even the ones that's not on the drawings.
You know, that's such a good point, Aaron, because I can't tell you all how many times we have looked at drawings and they're not right. And I don't understand what that disconnect is in facilities, but when you're trying to trace things through the facilities, whether it's plumbing or something else, we're trying to figure out what rooms are labeled as, but somebody stuck a temporary sign over it. They've made an office now a wet prep lab in women's health, or something crazy like that. Who has the real drawings? Maybe they don't exist, and you need to find that guy with the big key ring because that's the only person that really knows.
Well, and going back to that, like with all the emphasis on water management now, there hasn't been in the past. So like somebody put in a pipe here, nobody really got told, and you're just finding these things. I had experience. My previous facility was well over 40 years old, so trying to find all these pipes and stuff when we tried to do water management and we had floods and all of that, it was bad.
Yeah, I mean, Trey, you mentioned water management has created a lot of IPs into plumbing, very proficient in plumbing, if not experts in plumbing in their facilities, because they understand as well, if not better, than some of the facilities people of how water flows and where we have, potential hazards.
Yeah, and there's a lot of new guidance that's available now, especially for IPs who want to kind of learn the nuts and bolts. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the ASHRAE standard 188 on Legionella, which is a requirement, but maybe not as familiar with standard 514, which is newer, that actually looks at all risk when it comes to water management. And then the new AMI ST108, especially looking when your disinfection processes and your SPDs and the water quality that's required for there. And so there's a lot of resources that are now available that weren't out 10 years ago when I first started as an IP. That's valuable, that you should write down, ask for a copy, and start using that as a conversation point when you're meeting with your industrial hygienist like Nate or your facilities department.
And I would argue that even just 2 years ago, we didn't have as much information.
Yeah, no, 514, in fact, came out in 23. So if you were trying to breathe after COVID and you missed it, it's because we were still coming out of COVID. So there might be a lot of things that we're all still trying to catch up on.
I'm glad you brought that up too, and referencing back to the standards, because there are so many things that IPs need to be aware of and to look at, not just in what's going on in their own house, but how are the standards evolving. And so when we look at these areas that are at high risk for mold, it can be geographically, Nate, as you mentioned, or it can be, different areas. So SPD, tons of water pipes running behind the wall. It goes to about, 27 different points in that department. Dialysis is another one. So in your guys' experience, what's the first kind of what happens that tips us off that we may have a mold issue or the M word issue that we need to deal with?
Aaron, I'll let you start this one, Aaron, and I'll piggyback if I have anything else.
Well, so usually it's some type of complaint or observation. Generally, there's spots or something discolored on the wall, maybe a ceiling tile. I actually have a picture of a ceiling tile that somebody made into an image of Big Bird because the ceiling tile had been stained for so long that they literally turned it into the unfunniest joke for an infection preventionist. Right. And so usually it's something along that line, maybe during construction. Usually in construction, they'll usually poke a hole in the wall just to kind of see what's behind it before they start tearing it down. And they may make an observation at that point of some type of discoloration. And at that point, your facilities and hopefully you are getting engaged on, hey, we see something. We're not sure what it is, but it may be mold. And we'd like for you to kind of weigh in on it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that some of the more subtle items. I mean, the water stain on the ceiling, everybody kind of gets that one. But you start talking about more subtle things like if you're in a SPD and they have panelized walls and the wall starts getting loose, or your cove base at the bottom starts bubbling. Inherently, it shouldn't have been that way. A lot of these things are gradual over time. So it takes a fresh set of eyes. The SPD folks are in there day in and day out, and they really don't realize the big change that has happened. And the fresh set of eyes every couple weeks, once a month, saying, this is different. What's going on here?
And I think that's really, because with those panelized walls or the hard walls that they don't have anything that you can kind of see, especially the ceilings and stuff. I have trouble trying to figure out what's behind them sometimes. Hey, we had a leak in SPD. I'm like, well, I'm not quite sure what's damaged here. And I'm like, well, we have to cut into everything. And that's not a good thing to happen in SPD ever. So as an IP, I dread that all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I get my phone calls a lot faster whenever something's related to SPD. We need to control the environment really quickly. How do we section this off? How do we address it very expeditiously? And it's what caused this issue?
Yeah, I'll say I actually have a picture in one of my presentations that I like to show that actually shows an OR with a ceiling. and the ceiling looks perfectly fine, but then we put a FLIR on it, and that's that little device like you see on the cops that sees heat signatures. But in this case, when the camera is on, it actually shows an area of cooler temperature, and that cooler temperature on that surface is actually water that you can't see through the ceiling, but is in fact actually saturated and making that area colder. And that was when there was actually a water leak in an adjacent space, and we brought in a company that was trying to trace out exactly how far it had gone. Well, if that company hadn't been there, who knows if that water would have ever permeated through and shown itself. So what would have happened is it would have stayed in that above ceiling space, nice and wet, for a very long time. And you have all the ingredients you need now to have some type of mold issue start to pop up that isn't going to be seen until somebody pops their head above that ceiling and sees exactly how bad, or depending on the material of the ceiling, it starts to come through, grow through, and then it becomes evident to you. And that's how sometimes one problem poorly addressed, or I won't say poorly addressed, how about incompletely addressed, can lead to even a larger problem.
Yeah, and I mean the low end infrared cameras are, I mean, it's just a good diagnostic tool, and they're getting to the point where they're so cheap. You could probably get one for a couple $100, and it's a great, item to have in facilities or somebody's toolbox, just to say, all right, just let's spot check or sanity check half of these rooms, or when we think there might be something going on, see how much farther we need to dig.
I can hear the IPs thinking, all right, that's something else to add to my tool belt. You've got your vanometer on one side, and and then now you're and say the name of it again, the tool that
infrared camera.
Okay, perfect. So, and you bring up a good point with problems addressed incompletely. And I think we've all been on environment of care rounds where we notice the stain. And then if your facilities team is quick with it, they'll say, all right, good. We switched out the ceiling panel. And so now we can check that off. And you get a little bit of a facepalm moment to say like, hey, that's great that we did that cosmetically, but how did it get wet? How did it get stained? There's a bigger issue behind there that we need to think about.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. I mean, that's, we get calls, and it's not because the stain, it's what was the root cause of the stain? And, is it a pipe that leaked? And, that's a lot of facilities staff can go in, they can clearly see a pipe leak. But whenever there's not a pipe leak, is it a condensation issue? Why are we having a condensation issue? That's why we really get the phone calls of saying there's a bigger building science dynamic that people don't understand that needs to get addressed to truly fix this, wet ceiling tile that is manifesting the issue.
Yeah, I've actually seen interesting stories where facilities will tell me of a leak and they're tracing it. And then I go home, and the next day I have a text and an email that they're 3 stories up and they're now busting a hole open in the bathroom on this one unit. And by the way, we also have to bust holes in the 3 levels units below that, because this water leak started, on the 5th floor and cascaded all the way down to lobby, and it's a mess, and it's probably been going on for a while. So now they have to do all of this remediation, and now you as the IP are forced with this ICRA, where you're not dealing with like one specific place. You're talking about a number of vertical spaces, probably crossing different patient populations, and you have to start to put all of that together to get a good risk assessment and prevention plan in place so your facilities can go in quickly and deal with the job without causing any other disruption, both to operations in the unit, while at the same time making sure we're not exposing anyone, staff and patient, to anything harmful.
Water hits every little crack and it can travel horizontally, vertically. Like it's funny where it manifests itself and from where it started.
These ceiling tiles, have you guys seen these? They're like water repelling ceiling tiles. So they're almost like water resistant. So when the water hits them, if there's a leak, it kind of like shoots the water outward so that you don't have a stained ceiling tile because it's unable to be stained. Have you guys seen these tiles? It's great for facilities because then they don't have a stained ceiling tile, but the water still has to go somewhere.
Yeah. What you're talking about is typically like a vinyl wrap ceiling tile where there's just an exterior coating on it. And you're right. From a facility standpoint, it doesn't damage the tile. It just, moves the water to a different direction. So as long as you're not moving it to a wall and letting it, find a crack in the wall and hide behind that is fine. And it's easy to address it quickly. But it all comes down to where does the water start in addressing where the water starts.
Them kind of make IPs be quiet. Like, IPs keep reporting that we've got all these stained ceiling tiles. Well, if we just put this in there, they'll stop bothering us. But to your earlier point, where did the leak start and where did the water come from? It's not solving that initial issue.
Yeah, the water's eventually got to go somewhere. It's going to eventually pool somewhere. And at that point, it depends on what it's pushed up against. I think actually it's a great point that Nate brought up where, when something gets wet, you need to understand what that substrate or material it is that's coming in contact with. Because although you might be walking down the hall and see a smooth surface that's painted, it may not be dry board or particle board. It could in fact be like cement, or I've even seen these compressed styrofoam composite walls that are out now, and those will react to the water and have different risks for generating growth than say your drywall. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add about the riskier materials for growth versus the ones that are a little less risky.
I mean, I would just be a big fan if we did glass and metal everywhere. In newer buildings, we're building with materials. We're building with smarter materials, but you're still going to have your drywalls, your installations that are going to be moisture sinks if they get wet, and will retain moisture and then promote the ability for mold to grow. We're not getting away from those. We just know what we have to manage and where we have to manage it.
So I deal with a lot of construction in a lot of my facilities, and I actually have a construction cert for IP. So one of the things that we go over is the drywall. So like how you store the drywall as well, because sometimes there's been stories where some of the contractors have left them out and decided to put them up. And then they ended up getting mold and stuff behind the walls. And then especially in SPD and OR, now we're starting to put these vinyl floorings down that actually repel water, but it doesn't repel water once it gets inside the wall. So
it turns it into a nice styrofoam cup.
Yes,
and
yes.
It keeps everything trapped inside.
Yes.
So that's a cool.
You guys, Trey, you sound like the facilities you've worked in are very progressive, which is nice to hear because I actually get hired by a lot of general contractors that work in hospitals to do that kind of task of saying, all right, our moisture sensitive materials, are we storing them properly?
Mm-hmm.
Are we phasing them into construction properly so they're not exposed to the elements too long, or high humidity areas, especially, if you're working in the Southeast or Gulf Coasts, where exterior humidity runs 60% year round. So you don't want those moisture sensitive materials sitting out. And then even as on the installation side, if you could put gaps between the floor and the wall, it makes everybody's life so much easier, but it sometimes doesn't happen.
Now, this is maybe a silly question or a dumb question, but when we have the right conditions, are we always going to have a mold issue? Is there any mold-free spaces where we say, well, we've got a leak, but it's not going to result in mold over a long enough period of time?
So you say right conditions, Garrett. And realistically, to have right conditions, you need four factors. You have to have a water source. You have to have a substrate that will promote growth and have a food source. You have to have the spores, and then you have to have the right temperature. I've had, and if you take one of those factors away, mold doesn't grow. So great example is I've had air conditioners that have 3 of the 4 in place, but they're at 50 degrees, so mold doesn't grow. The minute you get into a shoulder season and you add a little heat into that air conditioning system, yeah, you'll have mold grow in there. But if you're constantly in a cooling cycle, you'll never see mold grow because that last factor of temperature is not in place.
Thank you for breaking that down. And that gives IPs some very practical things to attack, to say we need these 4 things. If we can prevent any 4 of these from impacting the space, we've got a better shot of mitigating this issue. Now, when it comes to the level of panic we should have for mold, sometimes we see big outsized reactions, panic, and we got to tear into this wall and got to cut everything down and send all the patients home, which is not realistic. And then sometimes things kind of just get overlooked. So how do we right size our panic when we see something that might be mold?
Well, I think, first thing you need to do is kind of assess first, where are they talking about, what kind of patient population, and for the IP, you go right into that risk assessment. Do I need to do something right now? Is this in a, I'll give you an example. We had a report of somebody saying, I think there's mold. And so I was like, okay, so they went up to the area. The mold that they thought of was in a med-surg unit in the shower in like a corner. And we're like, what's my panic level? It's like way down here. Right? But you get that same complaint, maybe on a wall surface or something, and you're in your transplant unit, you're in your ICU. Okay, now I'm a little more. Maybe you're doing surveillance. I hope everyone, I think IP has surveillance. Aspergillosis should be right up there with things that you should get pinged or pushed to you as far as organisms that grow, to just take a look and see, is this hospital onset or is this community onset? Is there any chance that it could have originated from the unit that the person was on or a unit that person was on? So that's step 1. Step 2, after you kind of deal with the immediate, is you're going to want to defer to expert guidance on that. And for most IPs, unless you have a background in industrial hygiene through maybe an MPH program or something, chances are you're going to be calling that out to an outside consultant, or if your facilities department has somebody with the right credentials, you're going to have them do the rest of that evaluation, because if they do find something, then you're going to need to go into remediation. You're going to need that person to be really calling the shots on what it's going to take, because this is a very specific item. And you don't want to be somebody pulling out a mold kit or trying to do like an air sample that you bought off Amazon, because depending on the region,
or you got from your big box store.
You have big box store, because depending on the region of the country that you're in, the climate that Nate determined, you may get results and you'll have absolutely no idea how to apply it to the situation. And now all you might do is inadvertently cause a stir without the expertise and the background on how to otherwise manage it.
So going to that, I've dealt with mold in quite a few facilities, and I've seen the wide range. So I get what y'all are saying, like, well, there's a little spot in the shower. That's not really that huge of a deal right now, versus, hey, I have a whole wall that has environmental growth or mold. And I've seen the wide range of how people react, especially to that big one where it's, let's just put some kills on it, and instead of finding out what's happening with it, versus let's tear down the whole wall today, right now. And I'm like, there's a middle ground between these. Going on that, what would you say to an IP if they did come across, I would say, like in a unit where they did find a huge amount, besides, how would you address that with the leadership? Because, you have to get the C-suite involved. You have to get all of that. And sometimes that can be such a struggle for an IP.
Yeah. So if you have an issue where you think you have an issue, so you get a consult, maybe you even have a positive culture from a patient, maybe it was a month ago. It may not be recent, but it was a month ago, and you have some evidence that there might be something going on, and you now have a visible spot that you're worried about. You need to act in some immediacy, help instill some immediacy, because aspergillosis is the most implicated in hospital-acquired infections when it comes to mold. There's a lot of mold, this very generic term we throw around, but there's lots of different bacterium that fall under that term. But I think the reason you hear aspergillosis the most is because that specific type is the one that tends to cause the most harm. And so that's the one that we really want to monitor and be alerted to. And so if you have that raise, you need to put that sense of urgency to get somebody in. Well, it's a Friday. It's going to cost time and a half or 2 times the cost to bring them out. It's like, well, you have this spot. We're probably going to need to move this patient away. You have at-risk patients within this area. I have this culture that I didn't know what to do with a month ago. Now I'm seeing something where maybe this was a source. And so we might have exposure. We need to really start focusing in on this and getting some more definitive answers. And this isn't something we're going to want to push off for a very long time. And then start looking at, do I need to move patients? What about the ventilation? It's kind of like, why do you put an area, when you're doing an ICRA and you put something under negative pressure, right? It's because you're creating a lot of dust. You're going to be upsetting all of that bacteria that otherwise was contained under the carpet, contained above the ceiling, contained behind the wall, but you're upsetting it now. You're releasing it into the environment because of the patient population. There's real risk of exposure and possible acquisition. And so you're taking a number of steps through that ICRA process to actually say, hey, we need to put under negative pressure. We need to eliminate or mitigate this risk. And it's the same thing if you were to see something like this. Okay, what do we need to immediately do to mitigate the risk to those people in the immediate surrounding area while we figure out if we actually have a mold issue or if it's something else that's staining this wall. Because I've seen also stains from lots of other different things. Rusty pipes are infamous for causing lots of discoloration as they bleed through because of, just the nature of what's in the water as it's staining the tile. But, safety first, right? That's what a lot of IPs go on. And that's what you want to focus on.
Now, when we get to the remediation stage, so let's say we've determined there's a problem, we've called in the right experts. As we round out this episode, can you walk us through what remediation looks like when we have a mold issue?
If you have not read or seen the new ICRA 2.0 template that was put out, I highly suggest looking at a copy. The nice thing that they did is they actually specified a section of that on what to do and what ICRA precautions to put the unit under if, in fact, you have something such as mold or also asbestos. I think they put in there as well because the classification will definitely change because of the nature of the organism, not necessarily as much for how much work they're going to do. And so first part is doing that risk assessment, making sure that at least for your part that you're going to control, you're going to help ensure the barriers are up. And then after that, the facility is probably going to be consulting out to, again, their defined expert who is then going to need to go in and remediate that. And I think, Nate, I've seen far and wide types of remediation that have taken place.
Yeah, I mean, the remediation teams or companies, they run the gamut. I've got some of my favorite ones, and I have some names that I stay away from, no matter what. If you're dealing with, especially in the hospital population, you don't want to call your franchise, your local franchises, because you don't know what you're going to get. They vary location to location. I would go with somebody a little more vetted than that. The biggest thing Aaron was talking about, the engineering controls are going to come in. But I also say, as part of that remediation, you need to bring in loop in all of the appropriate team members that are just making them aware of what the process is going to look like, how long it's going to be, where are we exhausting to? Are we going to have to exhaust back into a hallway because we're in interior spaces, or are we going to be able to exhaust to outdoors? And, letting the adjacent staff know that this is what's going on. And it's not necessarily you have to tell them everything that's going on. Just this is, the timeline, and this is what to expect to see. And if you don't see that, throw up your hand and say, we need to start investigating again because, like I said, the remediation teams run the gamut. And sometimes corners are cut, especially on third shift and weekends.
Thank you guys for running us through that, because that's probably one of the chief concerns from IP is we've identified the issue and then wondering, are we prepared to handle it and prepared to get it to the finish line where we're back to a safe environment. So Aaron and Nate, we want to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise and insights. Any kind of final thoughts or go-and-dos that you would have the audience, the IPs out there listening, take on this week?
I would say for this upcoming week, if you haven't talked with your facilities about water intrusion or when water leaks out responses, go talk about water intrusion, because if you don't start there, you will eventually talk to them about mold remediation, because a bad water intrusion process eventually will lead to a mold remediation issue. And so go meet your facilities, talk about that water intrusion, what you want to be notified for, check your surveillance, make sure you're watching on your surveillance, you have that aspergillosis and you're getting pushed, or when a case or a culture comes back positive, so at least you have awareness. And then figure out, who is your specialist? Do you have an industrial hygienist that's already on contract for your facility? And if you don't, that would be a great thing to bring up through your department to say, hey, just in event of this happening, can we talk about, defining somebody that I can interact with and call so that we can have that conversation and we don't have a delay in response.
And I think you heard me say this earlier in the discussion. Identify your big keyring person. Who's the person that really knows what's going on in the building? Because that's the person whenever something's going, and it's not always the managers or the supervisors. I mean, it sometimes it is the most humble, quiet, soft-spoken person, but they know what is really going on. So identify that person and start conversations with them, develop a rapport. So when something's going wrong, you can take the temperature of the building saying, do you think this is right?
That is excellent advice and very practical, concrete for us to go and do. Thank you both. And thank you, Trey and Jill, for joining us. We appreciate you guys.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. So I actually love that episode. Like anything to deal with mold and any construction projects, because it's just something that IP generally is involved in, but there's such a lack of, I wouldn't say knowledge, but there's an opportunity for growth in IP and construction. I did love that they talked about some of their stuff that they bring, like the infrared camera. I didn't even think of that, but now that I think about it, that's a great thing to bring. And it's relatively cheap that you can get on one of your budgets. But I love that episode, and I still have so many questions for them and so many scenarios I want to go through.
We want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode. Remember to like it, follow us on LinkedIn, and download this episode. And then also go ahead and connect with Aaron Preston and Nate Sanders. As Trey mentioned, there's tons more questions and tons more opportunities to learn about mold remediation. So we want to thank you all and remind you that infection stops where information starts.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.